San Jimenez lay folded between red stone cliffs and patches of dry chaparral, a town that blinked through dust storms and kept its secrets buried deeper than the old mine shafts outside its borders. Life there moved slow and cracked under the sun like old leather. The streets were lined with crooked wooden buildings, their paint long since stripped by time, and the saloon's piano hadn't held a tune in years. Nobody came to San Jimenez by chance, and even fewer stayed by choice. Thomas Evans belonged to that landscape like a worn boot left by a door. He was a mule driver when there was freight to move, fixer when someone's cattle got clever, and a quiet drinker when the bar was still open past sundown. He owned little more than the clothes on his back, a mule named Shadow with a bad leg, and a few memories that came and went like fever dreams. His mother had died when he was 19, her passing quiet and unremarked. His father, a restless man with gold fever, had vanished into the hills beyond Silver Creek and never sent word back. Thomas didn't expect more than what he already had. A cot in a stable, the occasional coin for labor, and a kind of peace in being invisible. The world owed him nothing, and he asked for just as much. So when the boy came running across the square, holding a pale envelope sealed with wax and speaking his name aloud, it felt like the town itself paused to watch. He took the envelope carefully. The paper was thin and fine, unlike anything used in San Jimenez. A red seal marked it, an emblem he didn't recognize, something delicate and curling like ivy carved in flame. He turned it over once, then again, half expecting it to disappear or prove someone else's mistake. But there it was, in a hand that looked practiced but not cold. Inside was a single folded sheet of writing paper. The ink was dark and steady, the strokes full of old grace. It was an invitation, brief, direct. He was to come to the Werner estate, located on the hill known as Gibson's Rise, northeast of town. No explanation, no apology. Just a name at the bottom, Rosalina Werner, and a final line beneath it, "Your life is your own, but part of mine is now yours too." The words held weight, as rumors always did, of wealth gone strange, of family lines buried with secrets, of a woman who hadn't been seen in town for years. Still, he felt the truth of the message in his chest, dull and persistent like the ache of an old brake. He didn't ask questions. He packed what little he owned into his saddlebag, tied his bedroll, and saddled Shadow without a word. As he left town, no one stopped him. No one called his name. San Jimenez simply swallowed the dust he kicked up and returned to its stillness. He rode toward the hills, toward a place where nothing waited for him, and yet, for the first time in years, something had called. The Werner estate rose from the rocky plains like a relic from a forgotten time, grand and lifeless. The road that led to it twisted up the side of Gibson Hill, narrow and choked with overgrowth. At the crest, the house came into view, a sprawling structure of faded white stone, ringed with tall columns that held the weight of silence more than shade. Its roof was streaked with soot, and the fountain at the center of the courtyard stood dry, cracked at the base, its angel statue missing an arm. A rusted gate groaned open as Thomas approached, and not a single bird sang in the branches overhead. The garden had long since surrendered to the seasons. What remained was a tangled mess of thorn vines, brittle trees, and scattered marble benches half sunken into the earth. The windows of the house were high and narrow, their glass dulled with years of dust and sun. It looked more like a mausoleum than a home.
She waited for him on the upper terrace, by stone arches and the peeling paint of wrought irons. Rosalina Werner stood still, as though carved from the same weathered stone as the house behind her. She wore black from shoulder to heel, a dress tailored sharp enough to cut, and earrings that glinted and deliberate in the fading afternoon light. Her skin was pale against the dark fabric, and her gaze, clear, fixed, unblinking, met his without flinch or welcome. She didn't move when he dismounted, didn't gesture him forward or offer her name. Instead, she turned slightly, lifting a glass of amber liquid to her lips with a motion so precise it could have been rehearsed. The silence between them was not awkward, it was intentional, measured, the kind of silence that made men stand straighter and question what ground they stood on. Silence, till it in all's own mess.
No intimacy, no demands, just a signature and a presence. In return, he would walk away afterward with a sum large enough to erase debts he hadn't yet named, with enough left over to build a life far from the desert wind. She did not explain why. She did not ask him to understand. Thomas listened, stunned not by the strangeness of the proposition, but by the cold steadiness with which it was delivered. There was no tremor in her voice, no hint of desperation, only resolve tight as wire. He thought to refuse, thought to turn his mule around and vanish before the sun dipped behind the ridge. But something in her posture, the rigid way her fingers curled around the glass, the way her shadows stretched beside her like a second self, stopped him. There was pain there, tucked behind the discipline, and something else, urgency. Perhaps vision-sized prologies and Facebook of the prodigitate. Whereas only see came his word. Monerican, Samdanas, Casing decision. Caymans, and to be days as they play devices, the days of the way, the day device. The way a shadow stretched beside her like a second self stopped him. There was pain there, tugged to be different to pain back in it, the second ain't a variables same differentiating basis. The quantitative states besistings chainings used for there the states marias and pace sem day bound the ostek stays off there. The offense is to dill the light far from the desert wind. She did not explain why it using there seemed to be other. There was no tremor in her voice, no hint of desperation, only resolve tight as wire. He thought the wire there's the status seemed to place him light. You don't seem to allow like second scenes of plow. Essentially, a pacing is there as a promises, but by the cold steadiness with which the ceremony took place at dawn, beneath a sky that had not yet decided if it would rain. The air was cold. The priest, a thin man with shaking hands and a horse waiting by the gate, read the vows quickly, never meeting their eyes. Rosalina stood without veil or smile, her hands bare, her lips pressed flat. She did not speak until it was her turn, and even then her words were mechanical, as if they had been written and memorized long ago. Thomas wore his cleanest shirt, stiff at the collar, and boots that still held traces of dust from San Jimenez. There were no rings exchanged, only signatures on parchment and the sound of quill scratching paper. The servants stood in the courtyard, still and silent, eyes downcast. They moved as if watching ghosts pass between them. When it was over, the priest departed without a word. Rosalina turned and walked back into the house, her steps light but unwavering. She vanished through a tall arched door on the upper floor, the only door Thomas had seen locked since his arrival. It closed behind her with a soft finality, and from that moment on, she was gone. Thomas lived in the east wing of the Werner estate, in a high-ceiling room with a narrow balcony that overlooked the vast sweep of desert beyond the hill. From there, he could see the land stretch out like parchment scorched at the edges, unbroken except for the occasional shimmer of heat or the distant flicker of a hawk gliding low. The air was always dry, heavy with silence. The sky, when not dust-blown, was a stark canvas of cloudless blue. His room was large, sparsely furnished, and cold. A four-poster bed, a writing desk, a faded armchair near the window. The walls were bare except for a single painting, something abstract and violent, a blur of reds and blacks that offered no comfort. A heavy brass key lay on the nightstand, his only real possession in the house. It opened his door, nothing more, and even that felt like permission, not freedom. Meals arrived without request solar meals. The butler, tall and spectral, appeared twice a day with silver trays, meats, bread, fruit, and tea, served without a word. He never made eye contact. When Thomas tried to speak, the man simply bowed and left. No one else addressed him, though he passed silent maids in the corridors, all moving as though drawn along invisible lines. They avoided his gaze with the same precision. Rosalina remained mostly unseen. Some days he caught a glimpse of her figure at the far end of the hall or heard the soft click of her heels on the marble floors in the early hours. Once, late at night, he heard music drifting through the house. Piano, slow and distant, full of sorrow. It came from the west wing, behind the locked door she had entered after the wedding. The music would start and stop without pattern, sometimes echoing faintly through the vents. Other times it was gone for days. The house itself felt wrong. Not haunted in the way old places sometimes are, but aware. The staircases creaked too long after someone passed over them. Doors closed themselves, slowly as though sighing. The mirrors along the hall reflected light oddly, casting shadows that didn't belong to the objects they framed. Once he caught his own reflection, turning its head just a second too late. He did not linger by the mirrors after that. Letters he left on the desk, half-finished notes to himself, idle drawings, Van Ada photograph. A younger Rosalina stood in front of the estate, flanked by unnamed figures, now little more than smudged silhouettes. Only she had survived. The knowledge settled in his chest like sand. Whatever arrangement he had entered into, it had begun long before he arrived. He was a piece being moved, not the hand moving it. He didn't ask questions. There was no one to ask. Instead, he began to test the house in his own quiet way. He left a coin on the railing of the second-floor stairwell. The next morning, it was gone. He tucked a handkerchief into a hollow niche behind a statue on the landing. By dusk, the niche was empty. He rearranged a stack of books in the library. By morning, they were back in perfect alphabetical order. No one mentioned it. No one acknowledged it. The house did not answer, but it responded. That was enough to unnerve him. He started to walk more carefully, step more softly. He noticed the way doors eased open before he reached for them, how cold air lingered in certain rooms longer than it should. He began to feel watched, not in fear, but in judgment, as if the walls remembered more than they let on. By the end of the week, Thomas was no longer certain who had invited him to the estate, Rosalina Werner, or the house that bore her name. One morning, as the house still lay wrapped in a silence thick enough to muffle breath, Thomas stepped into the western corridor and saw the door that had always been locked, the door behind which Rosalina had vanished on the day of their wedding. It stood open. Not wide, but enough. The latch hung loose. The key, always tucked at her waist, was nowhere in sight. The hallway behind him remained still. No footsteps, no wind, only the distant creak of the house settling in its bones. He crossed the threshold. The room inside was unlike the rest of the Werner estate. It was neither grand nor cold. It breathed. Dust lay like soft ash across the floor, undisturbed for years except by careful, reverent movements. The curtains were drawn, thick velvet pulled so tightly that no light entered from beyond. Yet it was not dark. A faint amber glow spilled from a low lamp on a writing desk in the far corner, as if it had been burning all night. The air smelled faintly of smoke and old rosewater. This was not a room built for display. It was a place of memory. Photographs lined the walls, most of them black and white, their frames tarnished with age. Some were cracked. In them, Rosalina appeared again and again, sometimes a child, sometimes a teenager, always surrounded by others whose faces seemed somehow less defined, as though time had faded their presence but not hers. On one shelf stood a dollhouse, carefully crafted, its paint chipped but intact. A tiny chair inside lay on its side. Beside it, stacks of letters bound with string leaned like exhausted travelers. Ash clung to the edges of the bookshelves. Thin as sorrow, some books were burned at the corners. One bore fingerprints along the edge, smeared with soot. At the desk lay a diary. Thomas opened it without knowing why. The pages were filled with careful cursive, each line precise, deliberate at the corners. One bore fingerprints along the edge, smeared with soot. At the desk lay a diary as pie-sized, such tactful as to say from behind therein the same things people in the birth. It was a record. Each page carried the weight of confession, grief and isolation etched into ink. He read of the fire that had taken her parents, her brother, the house staff. How she had escaped by chance, woken by a creaking floorboard, a dream she couldn't recall, a gust of wind that pushed her toward the window. How afterwards, people came with condolences and contracts, investors, suitors, opportunists. None of them saw her, only what she represented. They wanted the Werner name, the land, the story. She wrote of silence, of rebuilding stone by stone, but never the life inside it. Of walking through empty rooms and hearing only the echo of a house that had once been filled with voices. And finally, in the last entry, written in a hand that trembled slightly, she wrote of silence, of rebuilding stone by stone, but never the life inside it, of walking through empty rooms and hearing only the echo of a house that had once been filled with voices. And finally, in the last entry, written in a hand that trembled slightly, she wrote of silence says, of rebuilding stone by stone. It was a record, each page of problems concerning beef and isolation. It was a record of a resense. There was a record as that they once been filled with voices. And finally, in the last entry, written in a hand that trembled slightly, she wrote of the rave of the defensives. And you cried it to the real life fight at dinner. And finally, the remember me not through portraits or stories whispered in passing, but through presence, through being. The ink in that final sentence had blotted slightly, as though her pen had lingered too long before lifting. Thomas closed the book with care. The room felt different now, not less heavy, but somehow clearer. In the corner stood a chest, plain, iron-bound, unmarked. He lifted the lid. Inside were documents arranged with quiet precision, deeds, financial ledgers, birth certificates, a sealed letter addressed to no one, and on top a legal will, signed and notarized, bearing his name, Thomas Evans, beneficiary, the estate, the land, the accounts, everything. At the bottom, written in the same careful hand as the diary, was a single word, wife. He returned to his own quarters, climbed beneath the stiff sheets, and waited for morning, knowing nothing would be the same again. At dawn, the house stood quieter than ever before. Not the stillness of sleep, but the hush of something final. The air in the corridor outside Rosalina's room was empty of its usual fragrance. The faint trace of jasmine that had lingered for weeks now absent. Her door stood ajar. The rug just beyond the threshold showed the imprint of her bare feet. Delicate, fleeting marks in the dust-soft pile, already fading. The servants moved as they always had, but today their steps were slower. Their eyes stayed lowered. They did not speak to Thomas, and he did not ask. The silence among them felt not fearful, but reverent, like a chapel at the edge of morning. In his room, resting atop the tightly made bed, was a folded note. No envelope, no name. Just the message in her precise, deliberate hand. It contained no farewell, no explanation of where or why. Only this: you were never meant for appearances, you were meant to see. The house is no longer mine. It is for those still to come. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, though the air was still. He stood on the threshold of his room for a long time, looking down the empty hall, listening to the quiet groan of the wood settling under the morning sun. Then, with slow purpose, he dressed, packed no bag, and went to the stable. Shadow, his old mule, stood waiting as if he had known all along. Thomas saddled him in silence. He rode west down the path that led past the dried irrigation ditch and the broken stone wall toward the edge of the property. The land sloped downward, crumbling into a canyon carved long ago by wind and time. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the rock, painting everything in soft gold and muted red. He found her near the old spring. The source had long since dried, but the stone basin still held the memory of water. Rosalina sat with her back against a twisted cedar, her hands folded loosely in her lap.
The dress she wore might once have been white, now dulled by dust, age, and the weight of waiting. Her face was turned slightly upward, eyes half closed, the light touching her skin like a final kindness. She did not speak, neither did he. Thomas dismounted and walked to her, each step careful, not to disturb the air between them. He lowered himself beside her, close but not touching, and folded his hands in his lap. The wind moved gently through the canyon, brushing against the hem of her dress, carrying with it the faint scent of desert sage. Time passed without sound. Her breathing slowed, then, like the wind retreating over the ridge, it stopped. He did not cry, he did not call out. Instead, Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the cloth he had once left in the hidden niche behind the statue, an offering from a man trying to understand a house that refused to speak. He placed it gently in her open palm, closing her fingers around it. Then he leaned forward, pressed his hands softly to her eyes, and closed them.
2 months passed beneath skies that grew softer with each turning day. The dry winds carried less sting, and the sun no longer scorched the stone paths that wound around the Werner estate. Spring came shyly, gently, as if uncertain it was welcome. Thomas stayed, not as a master of the house, not as an heir to its weight and wealth, but as a keeper of something quieter. He moved through the halls without ceremony. He lit the lamps at dusk and opened the windows each morning. He spoke little. He wrote even less, but the house changed under his hands. Not rapidly, not in grand strokes, but in the way neglected things respond to care. He unlocked the main gates for the first time in years. The iron groaned in protest, then settled open. Within a week, the first of the children came. Orphans from the mission near San Jimenez, barefoot and weary. They were given beds in the east wing. They wandered the long corridors with wide eyes and bare feet, leaving laughter in places where silence once ruled. Thomas let them explore. He taught them how to tend the garden, how to patch torn cloth, how to sweep a room so the corners stayed clean. He fed them from the pantry and gave them names no one else had spoken in years. He opened the dining hall to the miners. Men from the southern ridge, soot-covered and sore-backed, found hot food on long tables every evening. They sat with quiet thanks, nodding to the man who said little but always made sure there was enough. No coins changed hands, just hands passing bread. The land that once carried the weight of a single name was no longer just his. He signed it over to the town under one condition, that a school and a library be built near the base of Gibson Hill. A space for those who knew neither lineage nor legacy, only the need to learn and read since decaying. He signed it over to the town under one condition, that a school and a library be built near the base of Gibson Hill. A space for those who knew Gibson Beep wanted to change his face to Cephalabies, the same bronzeable ways as he would deal at Tubuly, the base of Gibson Hill. A space for those who knew neither lineage nor legacy, only the need to brace some faces where silence once ruled. Thomas let them explore. He taught them how to tend the garden, how to patch torn cloth, how to sweep a room so the corners stayed clean. He fed them from the pantry and gave them names no one else had spoken in years. He opened the dining hall to the miners. Men from the southern ridge, soup-covered and sore-backed, found hot food on long tables every evening. They sat with quiet the neighborhood on base of Gibson Hill, a space for those who knew neither lineage nor legacy, only the need to learn and read and be warm. The mayor, skeptical but tired, agreed. Construction began slowly, brick by brick, beneath skies that now seemed to permit hope. In the far corner of the garden, near the last stone bench that still stood upright, Thomas placed a marker. It was modest, carved from dark wood. There was no name etched on it, only the words, "Here rests the one whose life was worth seeing." Whispers circled through town. Some said he had tricked her for money. Others insisted she had cast some spell on him. A few believed it was a matter of madness, that the house had swallowed him whole, just as it had her. But Thomas never answered the rumors. He let them twist and fade on their own. He spent his mornings tending to the house, his afternoons reading from Rosalina's journals aloud to the children sitting cross-legged on the old library rugs. One of the entries were about the fire, others about music, grief, or dreams half forgotten. None of them were about love. All of them were about being seen. At night, he lit the lamps again. He walked the veranda with a cup of herbal tea brewed from the plants now growing again along the garden wall. He'd sit in the same wooden chair, the one with the worn armrest, and look out over the canyons. The wind passed softly, rustling the leaves and stirring the curtains behind him. Every so often, It brought with it a trace of jasmine, light and unasked for. When it came, he would lift his eyes and speak into the air, not loudly, not long. Just a few words, offered not as prayer but as remembrance. I still see you, always.